Well, it's wonderful to see all of you here. This is a session focusing on extreme heat. And although it only went to 83 degrees today, I kept checking the temperature while I was here. We are in one of the places that is likely to be ground zero for these issues. So let's dive right in. We know that extreme heat has tremendous impact both on lives and on livelihoods as a direct stressor, but also in a way that increases other vulnerabilities. So let's hear what we're doing. Amy Knowles is the Chief Resilience Officer of Miami Beach. So tell us first, is heat different from other climate stressors? Is it a place where the horizon is worsening more quickly? How are you guys on the ground really looking at it?
Sure. And thank you, Dr. Rodin. This is such a pleasure to be here with you. We see heat very similar to a lot of our resilient shocks and stresses. We have a Resilient 305 plan that we have put together with the City of Miami and Miami-Dade County. And just funny or not funny enough, we didn't include heat as we put together that resilient strategy because we felt like Miami, it's hot, people know it, it's subtropical. But so many things have happened since that time. We've had devastating hurricanes that we experienced, situations without power, and there were so many deaths afterwards. We can't live without without air conditioning, in Miami. So it's incredibly important to us. It hits us with those extreme shocks, and it also is this constant stress that we face on a day-to-day basis. And it's something that impacts all of Miami-Dade County. Some shocks are just a certain area, maybe an infrastructure failure. But heat is something that is really, I think, shared by all of us, and we have to plan for it.
Great, thank you. And Eugenia, thank you for coming all the way from Sierra Leone, and share with us how sub-Saharan Africans experience heat and what the issues are and what it exacerbates.
Thank you so much. So as we all know, it's getting hotter everywhere. But more so for cities in the global south that are facing a lot of challenges because of extreme heat. In Freetown, where I come from, over the past 20 years, we've seen dramatic change in weather patterns, which has led to an increase in population growth. We've seen a lot of people moving from the rural areas into the city because most of the people in the rural areas depend on subsistence farming, and extreme heat is impacting the agricultural sector. We've seen an increase in informal settlement of about 74 informal settlement, accounting for about 35% of the city population. Most of these informal settlements are located along the hillsides and along the coastal lines of the city. So we've also witnessed massive deforestation along the line. And in all of this mix within that population, 55% of that population are women. So we've also seen an increase in and further widening of the gap of inequality, because most of these women also are traders, and they are exposed to the hazards of extreme heat. And we've also seen disease burden exacerbated by extreme heat, and women and girls are mostly affected.
So now we've defined the problem, and you can see how serious this issue is and how deeply and quickly we need to address it. So let's focus on the investments that are most critical. At the city scale level, at the community level. We just heard about the national level investments, but let's go to the city scale and the community scale to mitigate the impact of heat. Amy, would you talk first about what Miami Beach is doing, both in terms of current impact, but also planning for future impact, which is expected to worsen?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, we know the days of extreme heat is expected to double in Miami, in the mid-century. So it's a very serious issue. One of the things we have to do is redesign our urban fabric and our cities, which is not simple. One of the first steps that we've taken is to pass an urban heat island ordinance, which helps new construction be cooler, making sure they have new roofs, making sure that the surfaces used are not as hot, making sure that we have more permeable surfaces and more green space. We're definitely planting those trees. But we're doing it in a very strategic way, that we're planting the type of tree canopy that will be resilient in the future and really, in the places where people are walking that can handle the salt water that's coming from more sea level rise. And so we're doing it in many ways. The building that we were in all day at the Miami Beach Convention Center, I think is a great example, being built LEED silver. Those fins across the front as you walk in were actually built to shade that actual building. So we're doing it in the designing going forward, and we're starting to see the impacts of that.
Wonderful. And you've been sort of ground zero for innovation, I think, at the community level. Tell us about the innovations and the interventions, what you're seeing and what they cost, because we often think that these interventions are massive amounts of resources, but I know that you've seen some creative solutions that aren't that.
Yeah, so on our side, even though this is something that has been talked about, the knowledge around extreme heat is very, very low in Freetown. And so what we first of all tried to do was to understand the concept, the context of heat for Freetown, so collecting data. In partnership with the Knowles Institute, we've been able to conduct a first ever heat mapping assessment for Freetown, which will enable us to understand where are the hotspots, which communities are the most vulnerable, what's the pattern, and in building on that to then create a comprehensive, adaptive heat action plan for the city. Alongside that, there are people who are most vulnerable to extreme heat. And as I said earlier, women and girls. So we've been working with the Ashrock Resilience Center to prioritize women. And we have worked together with Market Women to co-design and co-create the Market Shade Cover project, which we just completed a few months ago. And the project seemed very straightforward, but very impactful. We made use of heat-reflective materials and target 3 of Freetown's major outdoor markets. We have 42 markets in Freetown, and 15 of those markets are without any structure or shade. So these women are exposed to heat. So the Market Shade Cover project enabled us to work with the women to create the shades, reduce productivity loss and economic loss, because most of what they're selling are vegetables and fruits. But also there's a solar component that we attach to the project, which enables them to have light in the evening and extend their market hours. We've also been working on natural-based solutions, looking at how we bring back nature into the urban setting. And the target is to plant and grow 1 million trees, and we're almost there.
It's fantastic. Really incredible. So Matt, congratulations. We just heard about Morgan Stanley's early commitments to this area, and certainly the $1 trillion that will be under management towards sustainability is just phenomenal. As we focus here on heat, in particular, what are the most impactful financing options? We have interventions to mitigate extreme heat. Some of them can be low cost, but many of them are high cost. And as you talk about the financing options, are there critical structures or are there critical subsidies that have an effect that could accelerate the impact of any investment?
Great. Well, first off, thank you to the Aspen Institute for putting on this event and Dr. Rodin for moderating a panel. I'm honored to be sitting next to you both here on stage. Heat is an economic issue too, extreme heat. And I think it was a recent Ashrock report that talked about $100 billion globally of lost economic value, including a high proportion here in Miami, going to, I think it was 200 by 2030 and $500 billion of lost economic productivity by 2050. That's a big number, right? So it is incredibly important to get this right. And I think there are many different structures to help finance this, big and small. I think we're going to talk a bit about public-private partnerships, which I think are absolutely key. And we just heard about the green banks and facilitating sort of regulation, legislation, the climate bank. All of these things are going to have to really play a meaningful role to get this right, because we're talking about big dollars and we're talking about long-term investments. I also think, just picking up on one of the things both of you talked about around nature-based solutions, I think there's this idea about canopy and trees and nature, which are essential to cooling cities, and thinking about how you start treating those like infrastructure, right? And there's a really interesting organization called Trees AI, Trees as Infrastructure, that's doing some pretty cool work because you have to figure out how to attribute value to trees in order to think about how to finance trees as part of the overall economic equation. So I think there's some really interesting innovation going on as well, big and small.
So often the private sector says, we could do all of this if government got out of the way. There are a lot of people from government here, so could you tell us from the perspective of investors how important truly you view government policies to facilitate what may make these investments have impact?
So I view them as very important. If we get it wrong from a policy perspective, we can inhibit and stop the financing for adaptation and for climate resilient, heat resistant infrastructure. If we get it right, we can accelerate it. And I think there is, figuring out that sweet spot from a policy perspective and then a partnership perspective, because it's about kind of facilitating it through policy and then partnering through the dollars and figuring out how we can make 1 + 1 equal way more than 2.
So let me pose this to any of the three of you or all of the three of you. The topic tonight of the panel is public-private partnerships. Do we know any, first of all, how would they work? Do we know any great examples? Are there partnerships that are innovative here? Tell us what you know.
I'd be happy to get it going. I can give you a couple great examples. One being, we have an area in Miami Beach, North Beach, that we adopted a resilient overlay for new construction and development for the future, for when that development comes in. And our planning team did a wonderful job with it. And they made sure that as new trees are planted, they have to be bigger trees to provide more immediate shade for all of the people that live there, but also that the root structures underneath can be supported. And that's very expensive, in a place like Miami and Miami Beach, because we're built on limestone. So our trees need soil and how to support them to live. And attaching that shade onto the buildings as an example. The hotel that's being built right now next to the convention center, a couple of months ago, there were 2 trees there, about 60 years old, these massive calophyllums, 70 tons each, and they were moved right over to another spot on the northwest corner of Pride Park, right outside of the convention center. And I think that's a testament to a public-private partnership where we didn't necessarily pay for that as a city, the developers did, but they understood our very aggressive tree protection code and really went through that process. And we watched it all and watched it moving, and we had to shut down streets. It was pretty amazing. But protecting what we have, I think, is very important. Countywide, there is a heat action plan. And those partnerships are huge. Our countywide chief heat officer, Jane Gilbert, is working closely with the medical community to really zero in on those more vulnerable populations and develop programs as well. So I think the partnerships really are everywhere, and as we're addressing it, it's much needed.
And you make such an important point. They're not just financial partnerships. It's really picking relevant actors, each of whom can do what they do best, and bringing it together so that 1 + 1 doesn't just equal 2, but it really has that kind of accelerator effect. Eugenia, any that you're seeing?
Yeah, just building from what you just said. Partnership is about bringing all the different stakeholders together, working from the community level, the city level, and the national level. Only then you will have sustainability. We need to ensure that when we also think about partnership and investment, we bring in the communities along with us, because for every investment you make, they will be the ones that will drive the investment. And the Freetown, the Tree Town campaign that we're running is one example that I'll give. We had this great idea of how we increase vegetation coverage across the city and reforest the deforested areas without any money. And so we had an event wherein we sold tickets and gathered the money from different residents, and that was the start of the initiative. But because we built on it, we brought together the community people, we raised the awareness of the need, and develop a comprehensive solution. We're able to garner resources from different private partners, but also people like the World Bank and Bloomberg.
You know, this is such an important area where communities, NGOs, you know, the whole civil society sector is really a critical partner in getting this right. They're so deeply impacted, and there are multiple ways that interventions could occur, some of which may feel beneficial to the community, but other that feel somehow intrusive. So involving them as real partners, I do think is so critical. Matt, what are you seeing?
So I think there's two examples at large scale, and then I'm going to pivot slightly. One of them is here in Miami, Brightline, which was something that we worked on, the first privately funded passenger high-speed rail system in terms of the public-private partnership. And more recently, we did a deal actually in a place that couldn't be more different than Miami Beach in Fargo, North Dakota, where we worked with the Army Corps of Engineers, some public sector partners, and some private sector investors to actually do the first public-private partnership under the Army Corps of Engineers PPP pilot project around flood mitigation. So I think when you think about public-private partnerships, I think the model is continually evolving. The pivot is, I also think there's a new set of capital that's emerging as investors or organizations are starting to think differently about allocating capital. You know, Rockefeller, the MacArthur Foundation, Omidyar Network forming the Catalytic Capital Coalition, and just thinking about, you know, not quite private sector, not quite public sector, but thinking about how to use that capital in a way to really facilitate adaptation, I think is going to be really important in the years ahead.
Thank you for mentioning that, because I do think that foundations here play a role in the kind of early stage risk capital that is catalytic, so that then larger scale partnerships can really take it to scale. And we at Rockefeller always felt that, and I know a lot of my philanthropy colleagues do as well. And it is a critical component of how to get this right without spending huge resources to know how it will work. Well, you know then from my work at Rockefeller that I see a lot of things through a resilience building lens and through both investing and intervening that way. And that really means the capacity to plan for, the ability to rebound more quickly and effectively if stress occurs, heat-related stress or others, and to grow and transform in the face of stress, not just try to bring it back to normal, because normal often had some of the elements that made you vulnerable in the first place. So really thinking about it this way and this new way is critical. I know all of you have thoughts about how that works. So Amy, let me start with you and ask all of you to jump in.
Sure. Well, I mean, I hope some of the attendees tonight were able to do a resilience tour. It's something that our team has been hosting every day this week, and we're so proud to share some of the projects that have been done. And just a couple of examples, one in our neighborhood of Sunset Harbor, we've avoided probably 150 tidal flood events because of the work that has been done. But it's not only the road elevation and adding the stormwater system and adding the pumps, it's also adding water quality treatment systems. It's also adding canopy. It's making the sidewalks wider and making sure that now those businesses have outside cafes where they didn't before. And so it's a more walkable and beautiful community. Another example is our dune system. This was something that was put in the 80s, and a berm came in and it just kind of washed away. And so then it was rebuilt and then it was vegetated, and that vegetation traps the sand and it creates biodiversity in it for our wildlife, and we're adding more shade to this area. And there's a mobility corridor, our beach walk, where people are walking and biking every day. So it has all of these benefits for our community, but it is our most protected piece of green infrastructure in Miami Beach to protect us from storm surge.
Thank you. Eugenia?
Yeah, so for us, building community resilient, we've been focused on developing a climate action plan for the city, which we are working on. We're looking at mitigation and adaptation, but mostly focusing on the adaptation side, because climate change is happening now. We're experiencing heat during the dry seasons and floods in the rains. In 2017, 1,000 people lost their lives a single day to mudslides. So it's about working with the communities themselves, reaching out to partners, ensuring that we have the finance that is needed to do this urgent work.
Thank you. And Matt, you have the last word.
Oh gosh, well, I guess we're to end this. So when I think about resiliency, I think about long-term, right? And when we talk about infrastructure, we talk about cities, we talk about the long-term. And so finding more ways to integrate resiliency, heat adaptation into underwriting, into financing, I think will be key. And also to your point around community, right? The way this works best is involving community, making sure community perspectives are heard. We run something called the Morgan Stanley Sustainable Solutions Collaborative, and there was an organization called IC Change that's actually using technology to help map people's firsthand response to extreme heat and climate disasters here in Miami, in New Orleans. And so really thinking about how we bubble that up into the projects that ultimately get developed and financed, I think will be really important for the long term.
Please join me in thanking our extraordinary panelists.